How does a single American destroyer survive an encounter with 5 Japanese battleships? October 25th, 1944. The waters off Samar Island in the Philippines. The USS Samuel B. Roberts, a small destroyer escort displacing just 1,350 tons, found herself staring down the most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since the war began. 5 battleships, 8 cruisers, 13 destroyers. Against her and a handful of escort carriers and destroyers that were never meant to fight a surface engagement. What happened in those desperate morning hours would become one of the most extraordinary tales of survival and heroism in naval warfare. This is the story of how geography, weather, and sheer audacity conspired to save American ships that, by every tactical calculation, should have been obliterated in minutes. To understand how this impossible situation arose, we must rewind to the larger strategic picture of October 1944. The Philippines represented Japan's final defensive perimeter. Lose the Philippines, and Japan's access to the vital oil and resources of the Dutch East Indies would be severed. The Japanese High Command knew this. They devised a desperate, complex plan called Shogo, or Operation Victory. The plan was ambitious to the point of recklessness. Admiral Kurita's center force, the most powerful element, would transit through the San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the American landing forces in Leyte Gulf from the north. Meanwhile, Admiral Nishimura's southern force would push through Surigao Strait from the south. The two pincers would crush the American invasion fleet between them. But there was a third element to sacrifice play. Admiral Ozawa's northern force, built around Japan's remaining aircraft carriers, would serve as bait. But these carriers were nearly empty of aircraft, their air groups decimated in previous battles. But American Admiral William Halsey didn't know that. Ozawa's mission was simple. Be seen, draw Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the invasion beaches, and give Kurita's battleships a clear run at the vulnerable transports and escort carriers. The Americans had cracked Japanese codes. They knew something was coming. On October 24th, American submarines spotted Kurita's massive force entering the Sibian Sea. Airstrikes from Halsey's carriers pummeled the Japanese fleet throughout the day. The super battleship Musashi, sister ship to the legendary Yamato, took 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits before finally capsizing and sinking with over 1,000 men still aboard. Admiral Kurita turned away, seemingly retreating. Halsey's pilots reported the center force as broken and fleeing. Then, late that afternoon, search planes spotted Ozawa's carrier force to the north. It was exactly what the Japanese wanted. Halsey took the bait. He turned the entire Third Fleet north, chasing what he believed was the primary threat. In doing so, he left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. There would be no battleships, no fleet carriers standing between Kurita's force and the lightly defended escort carriers of Taffy 3. Taffy 3 was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague. His unit consisted of 6 escort carriers, essentially merchant ship hulls, with flight decks welded on top screened by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, including the Samuel B. Roberts. These ships were designed to protect convoys from submarines and provide air support for ground troops. They were never meant to fight battleships. The night of October 24th passed quietly for Taffy 3. The small carriers continued their routine missions, launching planes to support the troops fighting ashore on Leyte. The destroyer escorts maintained their screening positions, their crews catching whatever sleep they could between watches. Admiral Kurita had not retreated. After reforming his battered force, he reversed course and pushed through San Bernardino Strait during the night. The strait was supposed to be watched. It was supposed to be guarded. But Halsey had taken everything north, and a critical communications failure meant that the 7th Fleet commander, Admiral Kincaid, believed Halsey had left a force behind to guard the strait. No one was watching. The Fox had entered the henhouse. By 0600 hours on October 25th, Kurita's center force had rounded Samar and was steaming south along the island's eastern coast. The weather conditions were typical for the western Pacific in late October. Scattered rain squalls moved across the area, creating patches of reduced visibility. The sea state was moderate, with swells running 4 to 5 feet. Cloud cover hung at about 1,500 feet, occasionally breaking to reveal patches of blue sky. Aboard the escort carrier USS Samuel B, radar operators picked up surface contacts to the northwest at approximately 06 for 5 hours. The contacts were closing fast. Initially there was confusion. These couldn't be enemy ships. The Japanese fleet was either destroyed or fleeing. Halsey's battleships were somewhere to the north. These contacts must be friendly. At 0647 hours, lookouts on the Fanshawe Bay's bridge spotted what they first thought were American ships on the horizon. Then someone noticed the distinctive pagoda-style superstructure. The blood drained from faces. Those weren't American ships. Enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 11 destroyers sighted 20 miles northwest of this group and closing at 30 knots. The message crackled across the task unit frequency. Aboard every ship in Taffy 3, men looked up in disbelief. Battleships? Here. Admiral Sprague later recalled the moment with stark clarity. I didn't think we'd last 15 minutes. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Canada's force included the Yamato at 72,000 tons, the largest battleship ever built, mounting 9 18.1-inch guns that could hurl 3,200-pound shells over 25 miles. With her were the battleships Nagato, Kongu, and Harun Yuch, displacing over 30,000 tons and armed with 14-inch or 16-inch main batteries. The heavy cruisers carried 18 Yuch guns. Even the Japanese destroyers outgunned the American destroyer escorts. Against this armada, Sprague had 6 escort carriers whose maximum speed was 17 knots and whose largest guns were single 5-inch mounts. His destroyers could make 35 knots in ideal conditions, but they carried only 5-inch guns and a limited supply of torpedoes. The destroyer escorts, including the Samuel B. Roberts, were even smaller, just over 300 feet long, armed with 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedo tubes. They were designed to fight submarines, not battleships. At 0658 hours, the first Japanese salvos arced through the morning sky. Its distinctive colored splashes, red, green, yellow, and purple bracketed the escort carriers as Japanese spotters used different dye colors to distinguish which shells came from which ship. The sound reached the Americans seconds after the water columns erupted. Freight train rumble building to a shrieking roar. Aboard the Samuel B. Roberts, bosun's mate Paul Carr stared at the horizon where the pagoda masts of Japanese battleships rose like monuments to doom. He turned to a shipmate. This is going to be a fighting ship. Going to die on this ship. Admiral Sprague had seconds to make decisions that would determine whether his command lived or died. He ordered the carriers to make smoke and run due east, away from the Japanese, while he directed the destroyers and destroyer escorts to lay a protective smokescreen. He launched every aircraft that could fly, regardless of whether they were armed or ready. Fighters, torpedo bombers, even planes without ammunition, everything went up. The carriers began generating smoke from their stacks, chemical smoke from generators on their fantails, and the destroyers added to the screen. Within minutes, a dense gray-white wall rolled across the water, obscuring the fleeing ships from Japanese gunners. But smoke alone wouldn't be enough. The Japanese were faster, their guns could reach further, and they had the weather gauge. Sprague needed to buy time for his carriers to run, time for his planes to rearm and strike, time for help to arrive from somewhere, anywhere. At 0716 hours, Sprague gave an order that seemed to be pure suicide. He directed his destroyers to attack the Japanese fleet. Aboard the USS Johnston, already hit and damaged, Commander Ernest Evans needed no further encouragement. His ship was already charging the Japanese formation. The destroyers USS Hull and USS Hermann turned to join the attack. And then, at 0730 hours, Sprague ordered the destroyer escorts to follow them in. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, commanding the Samuel B. Roberts, received the order with cold clarity. He keyed the ship's intercom, all hands to general quarters. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. The Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed Sammy B, began her final run. Her maximum speed was 24 knots. The Japanese cruisers could make 33. She mounted 2 5-inch guns in single mounts. The Japanese cruisers carried 10 8-inch guns and 5 turrets. She displaced 1,350 tons. The Japanese heavy cruiser tone displaced 15,200 tons, more than 11 times heavier. But Copeland had one advantage the Japanese didn't expect: desperation mixed with tactical brilliance.
Tactical
brilliance. And he had the weather. At 0750 hours, the weather took a dramatic turn in favor of the Americans. A heavy rain squall moved across the battle area from the northeast. These squalls were common in the Philippine Sea during this season, formed by the interaction of warm surface waters with cooler air aloft. This particular squall was dense and extensive, reducing visibility inside it to less than 100 yards. The American ships plunged into the squall like swimmers diving beneath a wave. Inside the gray curtain, the roar of Japanese guns became muffled and distant. The splashes of incoming shells disappeared. For precious minutes, they were invisible. But the squalls were moving. Ships couldn't hide in them forever. Samuel B. Roberts and her sisters would emerge eventually. When they did, they would be even closer to the Japanese guns. By 0800 hours, the tactical situation had devolved into chaos. Individual American ships maneuvered independently, appearing and disappearing in smoke and rain, launching torpedoes at ranges that would have been considered suicide in peacetime exercise. Japanese ships twisted and turned to avoid the torpedo spreads, breaking their formation, interfering with each other's fire. The Samuel B. Roberts emerged from a smoke bank at 0820 hours to find herself less than 10,000 yards from a line of Japanese heavy cruisers. At this range, her 5-inch guns could hit, though penetrating the cruiser's armor belts was another matter. Copeland ordered his gunners to fire for effect. The crew of Gun 51, the forward 5-inch mount, began hammering out rounds as fast as the gun could fire. They targeted the cruiser Chikai, walking their shells up her superstructure. Incredibly, the small destroyer escort scored hits. Her 5-inch shells weren't large enough to penetrate the cruiser's main armor belt, but they smashed into the superstructure, wrecking radar equipment, starting fires, killing and wounding men on exposed positions. The Chikai began to turn away, smoke pouring from her upper works. By 0835 hours, the Samuel B. Roberts had emptied her torpedo tubes, firing all 3 Mark 15 torpedoes at the cruiser formation. The crew watched the wakes racing toward the Japanese ships, running shallow at 45 knots. At least one found its marker. Gout of water and smoke erupted along the Chikai's waterline. The cruisers shuddered to a halt, taking on water. But the Samuel B. Roberts' luck was running out. Japanese gunners had marked her position. At 0851 hours, 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Kongu struck the small destroyer escort in rapid succession. The first shell hit the aft engine room. The explosion killed everyone in the compartment instantly. The second hit near the waterline amidships, tearing a massive hole in the hull. Seawater flooded into the forward engine room. The third shell struck the aft 5-inch mount gun, 52 penetrating the gun shield and detonating inside. In Gun 52, bosun's mate Paul Carr had been loading rounds manually, keeping up a rate of fire that exceeded the gun's designed capabilities. When the shell hit, it killed or wounded every man in the mount except Carr. Shrapnel tore through his midsection, nearly cutting him in half, but Carr was still conscious, still functioning on pure determination and adrenaline. He staggered to his feet, clutching a 54-pound shell, trying to load it into the breech. When damage control parties arrived, they found Carr holding the shell, pleading with them to help him load so he could fire just one more round. He died moments later, still holding the shell. The Samuel B. Roberts was dying. With both engine rooms flooded, she lost power. Dead in the water, without propulsion, she was a sitting target. More shells crashed into her. Fires spread. The order came to abandon ship. Men jumped into the oil-slicked water as their ship settled beneath them. At 0905 hours, the Samuel B. Roberts rolled to port and slipped beneath the waves, taking 90 men with her. 120 survivors clung to life rafts and debris and water that was still being churned by explosions as the battle raged around them. But something remarkable was happening across the wider battle space. The Japanese attack was faltering. Admiral Kurita had expected to find fleet carriers and battleships. Instead, he found small escort carriers that his intelligence had never mentioned, protected by destroyers that fought with insane ferocity. The American destroyers and destroyer escorts had charged directly into his formation, firing torpedoes, forcing his heavy ships to maneuver wildly, breaking up his formation. The smoke screens, the rain squalls, the desperate attacks, all of it created confusion. Japanese ships lost sight of each other in the smoke. Admiral Kurita's flagship, the Yamato, had been forced to turn away from a torpedo spread launched by the destroyer USS Johnston, taking the battleship far to the north and out of effective command position. Kurita lost tactical control of his fleet. His ships were fighting independently, focusing on whichever targets they could see through the smoke and rain rather than executing a coordinated attack. The escort carriers, meanwhile, kept launching aircraft. Fighters and torpedo bombers swarmed over the Japanese ships, making bombing and strafing runs. Many planes had no ammunition left, but they made dummy runs anyway, forcing Japanese ships to maneuver and distracting the gunners. Other planes dropped depth charges and anti-submarine bombs never designed for surface. Targets but capable of damaging thinly armored superstructures. By 0900 hours, the Japanese had sunk 3 American ships. The escort carrier USS Gambier Bay, the destroyers USS Johnston and USS Hull, and the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts. The destroyer escort, USS Dennis, and several other ships were heavily damaged. But the main body of escort carriers had escaped significant damage. They were still afloat, still launching aircraft, still running, and Kurita was receiving concerning reports. Cruisers reported torpedo attacks from multiple directions. Some of these reports were accurate. Others were phantoms created by the chaos and smoke. His staff estimated they were facing fleet carriers and heavy cruisers, not the escort carriers and destroyer escorts they were actually engaging. The ferocity of the American defense had convinced the Japanese they had stumbled into a major element of Halsey's Third Fleet. At 0911 hours, Admiral Kurita made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered his fleet to break off the attack and retire to the north. The Japanese ships turned away. Their salvos ceased. The escort carriers, expecting annihilation at any moment, suddenly found themselves steaming in water that was no longer being torn apart by shell splashes. Aboard the surviving ships, men couldn't believe what they were seeing. The Japanese were leaving. Why did Kurita turn away? Historians still debate this question. Kurita's own reports and post-war testimony offer several factors. He believed he was engaging fleet carriers and heavy surface units, not escort carriers. He had lost tactical control of his fleet due to the smoke and American attacks. His cruiser force had been savaged, the Chikai was sinking, the Chikuma heavily damaged. He was receiving reports of American carrier aircraft massing for a major strike. But there was another factor, the weather and visibility conditions. The rain, squalls, and smoke screens that had protected the American ships had also made it impossible for Kurita to accurately assess what he was facing. In the fog of war, quite literally, he had made a decision based on incomplete and inaccurate information. The role of weather in the Battle off Samar cannot be overstated. Naval historians later identified at least 7 distinct rain squalls that crossed the battle area during the engagement. These squalls, combined with the massive smoke screens laid by the American ships, created visibility conditions that were unprecedented in a major surface engagement. The timing of these squalls was critical. At 0750 hours, when the destroyer escorts were ordered to attack, a heavy squall moved across their projected path. This gave them cover for their initial run toward the Japanese fleet. At 0820 hours, another squall masked the Samuel B. Roberts as she fired her torpedoes, preventing immediate retaliation from Japanese heavy guns. But the most significant squall appeared at approximately 0855 hours, just as the American situation seemed most desperate. This squall was particularly dense and extensive, measuring over 5 miles across. It moved southwest at approximately 12 knots, directly across the space between the fleeing escort carriers and the pursuing Japanese battleships. The American carriers plunged into this squall and stayed in it, adjusting their course to remain within its protective curtain. For nearly 15 minutes, they were completely invisible to Japanese gunners. When they emerged on the southeastern edge, they had opened the range significantly. Japanese shells were still reaching for them, but accuracy had degraded. The carriers had gained precious distance and precious time. This squall's appearance was, from a meteorological standpoint, a matter of probability rather than miracle. The Philippine Sea in late October regularly experiences such conditions. Warm surface waters, often exceeding 28 degrees Celsius, creates strong evaporation. When this moisture-laden air rises and encounters cooler air at altitude, rapid condensation occurs, forming dense rain cells. On October 25, 1944, upper-level wind patterns were moving these cells generally southwest, which happened to be favorable for the Americans' line of retreat. But probability and providence feel indistinguishable when shells are falling. To the men aboard those escort carriers, that squall was salvation. The confusion created by visibility conditions extended to the Japanese as well. Admiral Kurita's staff, attempting to track targets through smoke and rain, repeatedly miscalculated both the number and type of American ships. When the destroyer USS Johnston launched her initial torpedo attack, Japanese observers reported her as a cruiser. The escort carriers, seen intermittently through breaks in the smoke, were reported as fleet carriers. The volume of aircraft attacking the Japanese fleet seemed to confirm this assessment. This misidentification had strategic consequences. Kurita believed he had stumbled into a significant portion of Halsey's Third Fleet. He reasoned that if escort carriers and destroyers were fighting this desperately, the American fleet carriers and battleships must be nearby, preparing to trap his force. Every minute he remained in the area increased the risk of annihilation. In reality, Halsey's fleet carriers were over 300 miles to the north, engaging Ozawa's decoy force. The nearest American battleships were in Surigao Strait, over 100 miles to the south. Kurita had an open path to the invasion beaches and their vulnerable transports, but he didn't know that. The fog of war, compounded by actual fog and smoke, had convinced him otherwise. At 09 to 5 hours, as Kurita's ships retired northward, the survivors of the Samuel B. Roberts and other sunk vessels floated in the water, watching their enemies steam away. They would spend the next 50 hours in the water before rescue ships found them. Many men would not survive the weight. Sharks, exposure, and wounds claimed additional lives even after the battle ended. Lieutenant Commander Copeland was among the survivors pulled from the water on October 97th. He later wrote of those hours in the water. The fact that we had engaged a fleet that outgunned us by a factor of perhaps 50 to 1 seemed surreal. But we had done it because the situation demanded it, and because the alternative was to watch our carriers be destroyed without resistance. The battle off Samar ended at approximately 0930 hours on October 25, 1944. When the last Japanese ships turned northward and withdrew, the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf, which Samar was a part, would continue for several more hours as American forces pursued and harried the retiring Japanese fleets. But for Taffy 3, the crisis had passed. The cost had been severe. The escort carrier USS Gambier Bay had been sunk by Japanese gunfire. The destroyers USS Johnston and USS Hull went down fighting. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts joined them. Another destroyer escort, the USS Dennis, was so heavily damaged she barely made it to port. Total American casualties from Taffy 3 exceeded 1,500 men killed, wounded, or missing. But they had succeeded. The Japanese had turned away. The invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf, over 700 ships, including dozens of vulnerable transports and supply vessels, remained intact. The landings continued. The liberation of the Philippines proceeded. Japanese losses were also significant. The heavy cruiser Chikai, torpedoed by the Samuel B. Roberts and later finished off by American aircraft, sank that evening. The heavy cruiser Chikuma, heavily damaged in the battle, was caught by American carrier aircraft later that day and sunk. The cruiser Suzuya, also damaged at Samar, was scuttled after additional air attacks. 3 more Japanese destroyers were sunk or damaged. But the greater loss for Japan was strategic. The Shogo plan had failed. The American invasion of the Philippines would not be stopped. Japan's access to fuel and resources from Southeast Asia was effectively cut. The Imperial Japanese Navy, already devastated by previous battles, would never again sortie a major surface fleet. The Battle of Leyte Gulf marked the effective end of the Japanese Navy as a fighting force. Admiral Kurita survived the war and died in 1977. He never fully explained his decision to withdraw from Samar. Beyond citing the reasons in his official reports, some historians have judged him harshly, arguing he threw away Japan's last chance for a significant naval victory. Others have been more sympathetic, noting that he was operating with incomplete information in chaotic conditions after nearly 48 hours without sleep. For the men of Taffy 3, recognition came slowly but eventually. The unit received the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest unit decorations in the U.S. military. Lieutenant Commander Copeland received the Navy. Crossbosun's mate Paul Carr was posthumously awarded the Silver Star for his actions in Gun 52. Commander Ernest Evans of the USS Johnston was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The Samuel B. Roberts herself received a unique honor. When the Navy commissioned a new guided missile frigate in 1986, they named her USS Samuel B. Roberts, FFG-58, after the destroyer escort and her crew. This new Samuel B. Roberts would serve with distinction, including striking a mine in the Persian Gulf in 1988 and remaining afloat through the determination of her crew, worthy inheritor of her predecessor's fighting spirit. Modern analysis of the battle has focused heavily on the role environmental factors played in the outcome. A 1998 study by the Naval War College examined visibility conditions during the battle using weather records and survivor testimony. The study concluded that visibility varied from less than 100 yards inside rain squalls to approximately 15,000 yards in clear conditions, with smoke reducing visibility by an additional 50 to 80% when present. This variability created what meteorologists call patchy visibility conditions, where one ship might have clear vision, while another ship just a few thousand yards away is effectively blind. Japanese gunnery officers reported frequent loss of targets during the battle, not because targets had sunk, but because they had disappeared into smoke or rain. This forced Japanese ships to repeatedly reacquire targets, reducing their rate of effective fire. The Naval War College study estimated that, under clear weather conditions, Kurita's force could have sunk all 6 escort carriers within 30 minutes of first contact. The actual battle lasted nearly 3 hours, and 4 carriers escaped completely intact. The difference between these outcomes can be attributed primarily to visibility conditions and the American use of smoke screens to exploit those conditions. On October 25, 1944, the crew of the USS Samuel B proved that courage and determination can prevail even against impossible odds. They steamed into battle, knowing they would likely not survive. They fought a ship designed to hunt submarines against battleships designed to kill other battleships. They bought time with their lives, time that allowed others to escape, time that helped secure the liberation of the Philippines. 120 men from the Samuel B. survived. 90 did not. Their ship rests in 22,000 feet of water off Samar Island, one of the deepest wreck sites in the world. In 2022, the wreck was located and surveyed by deep-sea explorers, still bearing the scars of battle after 78 years beneath the waves. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Secrets Reborn as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.